COVID-19 pandemic chronology video for today, Saturday, 5 November 2022. Instead of pandemic daydreams, I'm going to do a pandemic musing slash curiosity. And it's going to be related to some of the stuff I've been writing on Wikipedia about. So this is pandemic pit crew related for some of my junior and senior swimmers who've had, during the pandemic, been subjected to multiple bans for their nationality. And I guess it's kind of a curiosity amusing because of kind of some of the wording and terminology used in these bans, where at some points it'll be Russians and at some points it'll be Russian nationals, or Belarusians and Belarusian nationals. So it's multiple countries, multiple nationalities being affected by this. These bans. They started in December 2020, the ones that I'm writing about. So there's always, when something comes out in December 2020 in aquatic sports that affects aquatic sports, and it affected all sporting events, not just aquatic sports. But 2020, there were very few competitions held that year, especially international competitions. And so, like championships specifically. There was no world championships, there was no European championships, stuff like that. Short course and long course. And so there wasn't a whole lot going on. So in that sense, these bans might have at least partially stemmed from people not having as much to do. And they're like, you know what? Why don't we just escalate this and put some bans on some Russians and Belarusians? Kind of thing. And so, like, if they wanted to do it and want to get a feel for what the bans actually entail, why not hit it when competitions are on the upswing, right? To get a feel for what the bans actually do and what is required from the organization implementing the bans. So from like a business model perspective, I could see something like that. What is curious and is something I've mused on is, in some of the bans, there will be the terminology, the term Russian is not allowed, Russian national, Belarusian national, stuff like that. But then in some of their bans, they will say all Russians are banned or all Belarusians are banned. It's interesting because they also in their ban documentation and press releases bring up the term Russian nationals and Belarusian nationals. It says to me, Russian is a blanket term that, per their own terminology, if I'm interpreting the situation correctly, but they haven't put out any clarification on this terminology, so this is why it's like musing and a curiosity, is, do they mean Russian and Belarusian as in nationality? So it incorporates that nationals component and ethnicity. So if it's ethnicity, that would include anybody who has Russian or Belarusian in their family tree, or people who were born in Russia or Belarus and then emigrated from the country to another country later in life. And I would guess it actually means the nationals and people born there and people who have ancestry to there. However, I don't think that's how it has been implemented. Like, there are people who were born in Russia who after they were born in Russia went to a different country and are still competing. I know at least with the swimming press based in America, they really are like, why are Russian officials still being allowed to compete even if they were born in Russia and then moved somewhere else? So their nationality might not be Russian, but they were Russian by birth or by ancestry. And so it's been really kind of questioned, why aren't they being banned? When the ban says Russian and Belarusian, shouldn't they be banned too? That's an interesting thing, trying to tap one's family tree. So like, I've classified my mom's dad as 25% Norwegian. It's the biggest. I think I found out I was born in Bergen, Norway, so by birth and ancestry, it's the kind of the biggest chunk of my family tree. If you go back like thousands of years kind of thing, I think. But if that breaks down to that 25% that I've classified as Norwegian is 20% Norwegian, 3% Russian, and 2% Swedish, then technically these bans that have been implemented this year, 2022, during the COVID-19 pandemic still, against all Russians and Belarusians technically, and they mean ethnicity, which, because they didn't say the term Russian nationals and Belarusian nationals, is actually what they meant. People like me were banned as well. Which is a very interesting thing for people like my biography, Sarah Sjostrom, whose ancestry tree, so we actually share some Russian ancestry. If you go back like thousands of years, she's 48% Russian, 1% Norwegian, and then 51% Swedish. And so one of her concerns is she competed for Sweden, she was born in Sweden, she's Swedish, she's mostly Swedish by ancestry, like that kind of thing. Are they going to strip her of her medals down the road because she was allowed to compete? Like, she has Russians in her family tree, and she became the first European in history to win 10 plus gold medals at a world championships or something, and the most decorated male or female ever at the European Aquatics Championships and stuff. So huge, like monumental for those of us who are European. And are they going to strip her of those medals because she has Russian in the family tree? It looks like, so the swimming press based in America, based on what they're publishing here about really heckling the organizations that implemented these bans, about not banning people who were born there and later switched nationality. I would guess that these organizations have a long-term business model of stripping people like Sarah Sjostrom of her medals and her titles, back-actingly or forward-actingly applying those bans to me because I have 3% Russian in my family tree, that kind of thing. So I don't know, it's something that's interesting. It reminds me also, so this is more of the musing, I guess, of the anthropological principle or concept of observing a person or a community changes the person or community. What is often left off or people omit as part of that reaction. So there's a counter reaction, right? If somebody's making an observation of a community or a person, there's a counter reaction that balances it and stabilizes it for the change to happen. That would be called, or perhaps a way to describe it, a way to communicate it, is the person and or community being observed know at the time of observation they're being observed, whether or not they see the observer, and they know the intent of the observer. So like, I didn't see my rapist before he raped me, but I knew something bad was coming in the physical presence of this person. All right. So from my life perspective, it's a very real thing. It tends to apply when the observer has very bad intent and to violate human rights. Yeah. And so it just reminds me of that a little bit, is like, do they purposefully allow some of us to, like Sarah Sjostrom, to compete, that has Russian in her family tree, to observe her, to ethnically cleanse the planet of people like her and me? I know I've encountered people who hate Russians and say nuke 'em all. So that technically includes people like me because they did not specify Russian nationals, so people who live in Russia, which is always an interesting comment to get when people are like, we hate you. And you should be cleansed from this planet because of your race/ethnicity. I mean, in the rhetoric coming out of the American press claiming the Ukrainians as the chosen people mirrors almost exactly the rhetoric from Hitler and the Nazis in Germany. That kind of thing. So it's always an interesting thing having people actually say that to me, right? Is this should be cleansed of people like me on this planet. I don't agree. Ethnic cleansing is always an interesting thing. It's made a little bit more interesting when people like me actually have worked on nuclear technology, and you go, you ever wonder who's in charge of those weapons in the first place and who might be needed to detonate them? And I'm not suicidal, and I'm not about to go detonate a weapon on my own family. I guess there's, and so I'll kind of wrap this up by saying, I guess there's the, well, silver lining of, if me and my husbands, if me and my soulmates as soon as possible move to Russia, if that's where we end up moving, at least next, and they do decide to nuke all Russians in Russia, and I'm living there, at least I get to go down with the ship. At least I get to go down with my family. Oh, and is there anybody else in my family? I guess there's a back to the curiosity and musing component, is there anybody like in my soulmate pool, so to speak, who has been published is not Russian but is part Russian by ancestry, and that's my Kyle. So yes, so he's in kind of a similar boat to some of the other people who have Russian ancestry but were not born in Russia, I think anyway. Of does he get his medals stripped, disqualified down the road. Knowing these organizations, so like FINA and LEN and the International Olympic Committee, I'd say that's 100% guarantee. Just how long it takes for that to play out, I don't know. Russian and anti-Russian and anti-Belarusian, so it's two ethnicities being discriminated against and harassed these days, based on their nationality and their ancestry. And one could say that's in response to discrimination and harassment from them, but that those people aren't actually discriminating and harassing the governing bodies. So that's actually technically wrong. But those are the kind of organizations that don't like to get into technicalities. That's just their character. So yeah, so is it 100% guarantee, but like, it might take eternity. Maybe that's something that plays out in like heaven and hell, in limbo. Don't forget about limbo. There's heaven, hell, and limbo. Okay, pandemic musing and curiosity for today, Saturday, 5 November 2020.